which is called the Interactive Panel on Autonomy, Self-Determination and Personal Choice Systems in Law, Policies and Programs. We are 55 minutes behind, which means that we have to rush up, and I will ask the speakers who, I think a minute ago, said everyone has 7 minutes to be much shorter. Try to be shorter so that everyone can speak and that we can have some interaction here. So we have a very interesting panel. We have Klaus Lachwitz from the International Disability Alliance. He's the Secretary General of the International Disability Alliance, but he's also the President of Inclusion International, the global DPO representing persons with intellectual disabilities. We have next to him Ranveig Krausdottir. She's Professor and Director of the Center for Disability Studies at the University of Iceland. Her research examines the intersection of disability and other categories of inequality, and she has worked a lot on independent living as well. Welcome, Ranveig. We have Michael Njenga. He's currently working as the Executive Director at Users and Survivors of Psychiatry in Kenya. He is an Executive Council member of the African Disability Forum and a board member of the National Council for Persons with Disabilities in Kenya. Welcome, Micah. Then we have Martha Sticking. She is from the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights and works as a researcher and managing projects in the equality sector of the agency's Equality and Citizens' Rights Department. Welcome, Martha. Then we have Javier Arroyo Mendez. Hello. He is a graduate in physical science, and he has worked in technology consulting companies. He is coordinating a program on personal assistance services in Madrid, and he is a member of the Foro de Vida, Indipendente y Libertad. And I understand that libertad is a word which does not exist, but I think it is a mixture of dignity, liberty, and freedom. Yeah, perfect. He's also a member at a board. He also works with the European Network of Independent Living. Welcome, Javier. And we have Bhargavi Davar. She is a survivor of psychiatric institutions who is now working in Pune, India. She holds a PhD in philosophy of psychiatry. Dr. Davar is an author of several books and articles critiquing the foundations of psychiatry in India. Welcome, Javier. And then we have Peter Mittler. Where is Peter? There is Peter. He is Emeritus Professor of Special Needs Education at the University of Manchester. He has been trained as a clinical psychologist and devoted his career to championing the rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to education and citizenships. Welcome, Peter. And finally, we have Shanta Rao Barriga. She is the director of the Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. She leads research and advocacy on human rights abuses against persons with disabilities worldwide on various issues, and she's doing very interesting research. Welcome, Shanta. I will start with Klaus Lachwitz, and each of the panelists will get 2 questions from me, and I will ask you to answer them in the shortest possible time, possibly not exceeding 5 minutes. So, Klaus, my question to you is, how can we ensure the right to choose is made effective for persons with disabilities? That's my first question. And the second question is, what kind of support measures do we need for persons with disabilities when we implement Article 19? Thank you. Can you switch off my mic?
Well, I try to speak freely, and perhaps I start with an example. And this example shows that many people don't have the right to choose. So what is written down in Article 19 in practical life sometimes has not been implemented. About 1 year ago, I visited an institution in Germany run by the churches, and there were 4 adults living in one room all together. And I asked them, do you enjoy to be here? Do you enjoy life? Do you enjoy to be four together in one room? And the answer was, yes, we do. We do. It's very nice here, and we are fat, and we have some things to do, etc., etc. But then I found out nobody of them ever had the chance to find out what an alternative would exist. So to try alternatives, I think, is a basic criteria to make choices. Otherwise, you can't make choices. Two of these four persons are under guardianship. In Germany, we call it custodianship, but it's still quite similar to guardianship. So after 1 year, all of them were asked, well, do you want to move to another place? We have flats now in the midst of the city, and we have personal assistants organized, so you can try to make a change. And they did, and they had the chance to try that for about 4 weeks, and after 4 weeks they were asked, do you want to stay in these flats now, or do you want to go back to the institution? And all four of them said, no, now we want a change. We want to make a try, and we want to have assistance, etc., etc. But two of them had to ask their guardians whether they are allowed to do that. Fortunately, it was allowed. But this example shows to make choices means to have full legal capacity. Otherwise, another person is make the decision for you. So I think there's a link between Article 12 and Article 19. And fortunately, the Convention guarantees that everybody has legal capacity in the same way other persons have it. So I think that example shows that we first have to watch how people live. And we know many, many people still live in big institutions without privacy. And I have found that, for instance, some of these institutions are run by directors who have full guardianship over all the people who are placed there. So this is absolutely horrible. This is totally against Article 12 and Article 19, and that, I think, shows if we want to realize what choice means, we have to close down these big institutions. The other example is that in many parts of the world, services, personal assistance does not exist. The only support people receive, persons with disabilities, persons with intellectual disabilities, psychosocial disabilities, persons with dementia, etc., is by the families. They live with the families, and the families have all the responsibility. So it means if we organize personal assistance and support, it means to support families in these places. For instance, in many parts of Africa, in Asia, etc. We have to build up these services. They don't exist. And Article 19 shows we are very flexible to do that. It's a very flexible provision, and we have all chances to do what we think is the good way to do it. But for that, we need, of course, financial support, and that's another problem. We watch that in many countries the financial support is cut, the budgets are cut. For instance, in my own country, in Germany, we have 1 million refugees now coming from Syria and other parts of the world, and all that has to be financed and paid by communities, and the communities are responsible to support persons with disabilities. So there's a clash of interest. The budgets don't grow, the budgets are the same, and I'm pretty sure this is happening worldwide in other places too. So I finish up with these examples because I know time is short. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And my next speaker is Michael. I have two questions for you, and they are, what are the main challenges for persons with psychosocial disabilities in relation to Article 19? And the second question is, could you tell us a little bit about the African context in relation to Article 19, the right to independent living and living in the community? Thank you. Again, you have 5 minutes.
It's okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would start by addressing the first question. I think in Africa, we live with our families and we live within our communities. And also it's important to state out that there are very, very few institutions in Africa. But that does not mean that persons with disabilities are able to live independently and be included in the community. And this is because of a couple of things. Firstly, we live in a very communal way, especially in the rural areas. And I think sometimes community interest more than often will override personal choices. So it becomes very, very difficult, not only for persons with disabilities, but every person broadly, to balance what is the interest of the community and also what you would want to do as a person within that particular community. The other thing, and which have been highlighted by the other speaker, is that most persons with disabilities live in extreme poverty, and there are very high level of unemployment among persons with disabilities. And also we have to recognize that there is limited state support for persons with disabilities. Then this means that persons with disabilities mostly have to depend on their families. And I think, broadly speaking, for any person, when you rely so much on your family, then the discussion is always between the best interest of that particular family vis-a-vis your will and preference, which again become an obvious sense of tension when you want to make choices and to be included within your community. The other thing is Article 19 is about access to community services. Mostly services are not available within the community, and even when services are available, they are not responsive to the needs of persons with disabilities within that particular community. And we have to recognize that in Africa, sometimes we also have harmful cultural practices, like the prayer camps, which are very, very common in West Africa, or civil detention where persons with disabilities are detained within their homes. In relation specifically to persons with psychosocial disabilities and the challenges they confront, I think for me one of the biggest challenges is community perception. When you are seen, when the community views you as a lesser human being, when the community views you as dangerous, when the community views you as incapable, then you live in the peripheries of the society, you live in isolation, and it is very, very difficult for you to be included and to participate within your community. The second one, obviously, is mental health law. When laws allow for people to be put in institutions by force, when laws deprive you of your legal capacity, it is very, very difficult for you to be able to live fully in the community and being included. Because certainly in an institution, you do not have choices. When you're deprived of your legal capacity, then you cannot make choices about your life on an equal basis with others. I have highlighted the impact of cultural practices, which is very common in Africa. If you go to West Africa, there are a lot of big prayer camps where persons with disabilities are detained. And at the end of the day, if you're living in a prayer camp, then it means you cannot participate in your community. It means you cannot make simple decisions like who do you visit within your community, whether you want to attend family gatherings within your community, whether you want to access services within that particular community. And I think we really have to look at the bad cultural practices which at the end of the day keep persons with disabilities in institution frameworks. The denial of reasonable accommodation for persons with psychosocial disabilities is also a challenge in terms of them being included in the community. Because at the end of the day, the education system is not accommodative. It is not inclusive. It is not supportive of persons with psychosocial disabilities. And even systems of justice they do not provide reasonable accommodations for persons with psychosocial disabilities. I have highlighted the unavailability of services. We are talking about Article 19, about the right to choose services within the community. at the end of the day, these services might not be available. And even when they are available, they are not responsive to the needs of persons with psychosocial disability. For example, mental health services, which are purely built on a medical model. So you are telling persons with psychosocial disability to choose, and yet there are no alternatives which are developed within communities for them to be able to choose. I've spoken about the high level of poverty and unemployment. At the end of the day, there is a relationship between poverty and your ability to make decisions, unemployment and your ability to make decisions. Accessing services sometimes is also about spending money. It's about affordability. So when people are dependent in their families, they can't make choices. When people are dependent on their families, they can't make choices. And when they do not have money, it is difficult for them to access services within their community. Lastly is the lack of support services. I think the three key pillars of Article 19, it's about choice, it's about access to community-based services, and it's about support services to enable persons with psychosocial disabilities to access those particular services. And when you do not provide support services within the community, I think it's very, very difficult. That in itself is a barrier to persons with psychosocial disabilities accessing services within their community. And certainly I have to point out the over-reliance on family-based support, which sometimes is not based on the will and preference of the person, but rather on the best interest of that particular person. The last bit is the whole issue of identity, that sometimes persons with psychosocial disabilities are not accepted due to the medical model as persons with disabilities, which at the end of the day makes it difficult for them to access disability-related services within their community, or even mainstream services within our communities, which are for persons with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael and Jenga. Now we had two men, now we will have two women. First is Ranvai Kraus-Dadottir, and my two questions to you are, how can national and local level work together to ensure effective Article 19 implementation? And my second question, what is the role of organizations of persons with disabilities in relation to the implementation of Article 19? Thank you.
Well, the first question about how national and local levels can work together specifically addresses countries where the services and the responsibility for disability services have been decentralized. And just to highlight the problems, if these two levels are not working together, I will briefly mention a couple of examples. One is that this can lead to a disjuncture between the national policy and the local implementation. National legislation may obligate municipalities to offer particular services, such as personal assistance or other services for independent and community living. However, the municipalities, they also want to be independent and autonomous and decide what services they offer and what financial possibilities they have to do so, so that they want to decide what services should be available. And this makes services within the same national borders often very different from one another. So to comply with Article 19, states must address these regional inconsistencies within their borders. The other problem is that this makes it really hard for a person to move from one municipality to another, because it's not guaranteed that the same service is available in another municipality. So people are stuck where they live very often. So for these two levels to work, national and local level to work together, I think it's important to have strong national legislation where the role of each level is very clearly articulated and where key provisions are clearly defined. Another way to work together is to strengthen the implementation and monitoring mechanisms outlined in Article 33. within local and national governments, and to provide resources and to make sure that within these mechanisms there is local and national collaboration and knowledge of disability issues, human rights, and the CRPD, and so on. And finally, I think it's important to build capacity at national and local levels. There is too much lack of knowledge about disability issues. And the national level, who has the obligation to take the lead in this, for example, to make sure that everyone involved recognizes the social, relational understanding of disability, that there is understanding of human rights principles, the requirements of the CRPD. Capacity building must be accessible to all those who are involved in implementing Article 19, politicians, service providers, professionals, architects, and everyone who comes into contact with disabled people and have a hand in planning and organizing community life in general. So the second question I was asked to address was what I consider DPO's role, disabled people's organizations' roles should be in implementing Article 19. Well, briefly, I can say that the role of DPOs and people with disabilities in general are vital when implementing Article 19. Just look at all the services we have today which have been developed without implementing disabled people, and look at the trouble we are in, and what we are battling today. So we have to include disabled people as active members. So people with disabilities should be involved and have roles as individuals, as consultants, as representatives of the disabled people's organizations, representing the full range of impairments, including women and men, and boys and girls, and various ethnic groups. They should also be employed as specialists within ministries and other bodies, and they should be employed and as monitors of human rights of all people with disabilities. And this must be cross-society, cross-disability, include poor, homeless, institutionalized people, refugees, and so on. I think also, just to round up, that the most important aspect to ensure that persons with disability can effectively and actively engage, it requires that we build capacity among people with disabilities and their representative organizations. That is, understanding of human rights principles, the CRPD requirements, and so on. And capacity building must be accessible to all persons with disabilities and be empowering for them to take active role in implementing Article 19.
Thank you very much, Rangwei. Thank you very much, Rangwei. And I turn now to Martha Stickings. And I have two questions for you, and they are, first, how can Article 19 be monitored? And the second question is, what role do the European institutions have when we think about implementing Article 19? The floor is yours, Martha.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Before we actually talk about how Article 19 can be monitored in practice, I think it's also important to set out some of the groundwork that needs to be done prior to embarking upon monitoring, so that there's a solid foundation on which actual monitoring activities can themselves be based. At the core of this is to break down what it actually means to implement Article 19 in practice. What are the key components of Article 19? What is the spirit of the article? What are the essential issues that need to be addressed if Article 19 is going to be made real for persons with disabilities in their daily lives? Of course, this also includes interaction with other rights. We've already heard about legal capacity, we've heard about accessibility, but of course there are numerous other articles that come into play when we talk about Article 19. And I think it's important that when monitoring Article 19, we also take heed of the role that achieving other rights has to play in the eventual achievement of Article 19. Key to establishing what Article 19 means in practice is the question of clarity over the definitions of key terms. Those of us that were there at the side event this morning will have heard a lot of discussion about the misappropriation of terminology related to independent living and also to types of community-based services. And I think it's very clear and very important before embarking on monitoring of Article 19 that there be a widespread understanding and a common understanding of what some of the key terms in relation to independent living actually mean. Linked to those 2 points is also the question about having clear and consistent standards against which Article 19 can be monitored. If there aren't sort of benchmarks, if there aren't clear goals to be met, then it can be very difficult to be able to effectively monitor practice against what ought to be in place. And lastly, of course, is the involvement of disabled persons organisations and self-advocates in developing appropriate monitoring mechanisms, not just, of course, in the subsequent monitoring, but also thinking about, well, what would it mean to monitor the implementation of Article 19 in a meaningful way? So if that's some of the groundwork that needs to be put in place, then of course there are a multitude of ways that Article 19 can be monitored in practice. And I'm just going to pick out a few different ways. One important element is research and data collection to get a good sense of what the current situation is on the ground and to see how Article 19 is being implemented, is not being implemented, could be better implemented. This, of course, links very much to Article 31 in terms of data collection and statistics. But I think it's not just a question of survey data, extremely important though that is, and very much lacking though that also is. But it's also important to get the context and to, of course, speak to persons with disabilities themselves about their experiences of Article 19 and what implementation has or could mean to them. Part of this research also can involve the development of human rights indicators. And that's something that my organisation, the Fundamental Rights Agency, has been involved in for several years. Using the framework of structure, process and outcome indicators that has been developed by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights can really help to break down the different stages of Article 19 implementation in terms of thinking about, well, what are the commitments that governments have signed up to, what are the efforts that they're undertaking to implement those commitments, and then what are the outcomes of those standards, of those efforts in practice for people with disabilities in their daily lives. Developing indicators in this way, based on some of the groundwork elements that I mentioned previously, including thinking about what the key components of Article 19 are, can be an effective way to monitor how the article is being implemented, particularly if this is repeated over time, to get a sense of progression, we hope, but also, of course, the potential for regression and for not very much to change at all. Linked to indicators is the importance of having clear targets and timeframes that are associated with any strategies to implement Article 19. And we see certainly from the research that we do within the European Union that there are too many policies and strategies which don't have clear targets and which don't set a time frame for them to be met and a clear set of indicators against which their implementation can be monitored. So I've already hinted in all of that in terms of what the role of the European institutions can be when implementing and monitoring Article 19. I can't speak on behalf of the EU institutions as a whole, but I can indicate some ways in which they can be involved in implementation and monitoring. One relates to law and policy action, so both the development of new laws to implement Article 19, but also, of course, and this is extremely important, the implementation of existing legislation that has a bearing on Article 19. There's also policy documents in the EU. The current European Disability Strategy is in the process of being reviewed, and that will be a very important overarching tool for the implementation of Article 19, amongst others. Secondly is, of course, and ultimately it often comes down to this, the question of money. Within the European Union, there are the European Structural and Investment Funds, which are extremely considerable in their value and which can be used, we hope, to promote Article 19, although, of course, there are too many examples of that not having happened. There's also the potential to share experiences amongst different member states. And thirdly and finally is the question of research and data collection, coming back to that, and the importance also of being able to have comparative research from across different countries, to be able not only to get a sense of progress in different places, but also to be able to capture what we hope would be the positive implications of good policies, of good programs and good projects.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marta Stickings. And I turn now to Javier Arroyo Mendez. And my questions to you are, how can we indicate the level of implementation of Article 19? And the second question is, what are the roles of government and DPOs, organizations of persons with disabilities, in this implementation process? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, yo voy con el español. Vengo justamente de España, que es un país que ha firmado y ha ratificado la Convención de Naciones Unidas, entonces se supone que podríamos tener un nivel del 100% de implementación del artículo 19 y que podríamos elegir dónde vivimos, cómo vivimos y de qué forma vivimos. Esto realmente no es así. Y no es así porque la ley que trata de proporcionar el apoyo económico para contratar un asistente personal, a la vez proporciona, da acceso a residencias, instituciones, centros de día y demás. Es difícil la cuestión de cómo monitorizas el nivel de implementación del artículo 19, entre otros motivos también porque se están colando como vida independiente cosas que no son vida independiente. Se está hablando de vida independiente cuando, por ejemplo, estamos hablando de pisos tutelados en los que a las personas se les está enseñando cómo usar sus capacidades residuales, por así decirlo, para realizar las tareas domésticas. Se está hablando de artículo 19 cuando estamos hablando de residencias, de instituciones en las cuales a las personas que trabajan ahí se les quita el uniforme y entonces se genera un ambiente más hogareño y dices que eso es que estás implementando el artículo 19 y en realidad no tiene nada que ver porque el artículo 19 por la filosofía que emana tiene que ver no solamente con poder tomar decisiones sobre dónde vives, sino también decisiones que afecten a cualquier aspecto de tu día a día. Entonces, no es suficiente con que sea una solución habitacional con un determinado tipo de apoyos, sino que necesitas poder tener esa herramienta que es la asistencia personal que te proporcione apoyo en cualquier momento de tu día. A mí me parece que una manera, por ejemplo, de medir cuál es el nivel de implementación de esto es si ahora mismo un Estado está invirtiendo X dinero en soluciones de tipo residencial, hagan un planteamiento para que al cabo de 5 años esa misma cantidad de dinero se esté invirtiendo directamente en asistencia personal que llegue a las personas y que puedan contratar asistentes personales con este dinero. En cuanto al papel del Gobierno a la hora de mejorar la implementación del artículo 19, yo creo que en el caso de España, de manera bastante clara, tendría que hacer desaparecer la ley la ley de dependencia, que llaman, que proporciona esta prestación económica de asistencia personal, pero también el acceso a todos estos otros servicios y que está basada completamente en el modelo médico rehabilitador y no en el modelo social que inspira la Convención de la ONU. Y creo que el papel de las organizaciones de personas con discapacidad debe ser fundamentalmente un papel formativo a las propias personas, pero más allá de coger y dar un discurso y decir hay una convención de derechos humanos que está aplicado, sino el papel de empoderar, de dar herramientas para empoderar a las personas con diversidad funcional y que sean ellas las que decidan tomar las riendas de su propia vida.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Javier, and also for keeping the time so well. Everyone has been so disciplined. Thank you so much. But it gives us the chance that every speaker has a chance to speak. So I turn now to Bagavi Davar. And my questions to you are, what is the current level of implementation of Article 19 in Asia? And the second question, what is the role organizations of people with disabilities play in the implementation and monitoring of Article 19? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try not to repeat what others have already said in order to save on time. Coming from an Asia perspective and coming from perspective of persons with psychosocial disabilities in Asia, we feel that it's the most important question for interpreting Article 19 is a question relating to how do state parties relate to communities. Are they coming in proactively in order to foster and culture local community life, culture, values and habitats, lifestyles, indigenous ways of living, indigenous ways of making choices, and so on, or are they coming in order to solve a problem and be basically an agency which protects communities by law? So this has been for us a major question. We feel that for Article 19 to realize completely the rights of the CRPD needs to be manifested within small social units in local communities, within families, within neighborhoods, within schools, within workplaces. All that goes to make up a local area of people sharing natural resources, other resources, and working together. And for this, we feel that there are some very important indicators that must be fulfilled for persons with disabilities and for persons with psychosocial disabilities. One is the availability of a continuum and diversity of services. A lot of us talk about how many different kinds of services must be available, but people fall through the cracks when there are no interlinking, services which connects, for example, education with employment or social protection with employment. Those interlinking spaces are not often available. So a person will reach up to point B, but may not reach up to point D or E, and then fall through the crack and then comes within other kinds of. So for us, continuity of services is so very important. And we also feel that services must not come in too much in the way of non-formal systems which may already exist, the support systems. I think several of us mentioned family as the most important support system. Family, again, plays two kinds of roles in the lives of persons with disabilities and may not always be supportive. But if those non-formal care systems are also considered as part of the continuity of support given to persons with disabilities, then Article 19 stands to be realized in greater strength within local communities. We appeal to the committee to really discuss the relationship of the state with respect to communities, how the states can enable and proactively facilitate community processes and actions through a wide range of actions, awareness, capacity building, and it may require creation of new kinds of organizations and development practices to foster inclusion. We don't see that, we often consider that constitutional provisions will ensure the right to living in the community and living independently, but often it does not. States often come in a negative way. For example, with the mental health law and incapacity laws, in Asian region there are many countries with still the colonial legal baggage where the law actually, instead of coming in proactively, has actually led to division of interest between family members and the ousting of a family member into spaces where they don't want to be. It's not, it's not a place of residence that they will prefer to be in. And also under the rubric of community mental health services, mental institutions continue to be given an important place as long-term residential care. And so there are many such examples, and they have not fostered social, family, or community development. They have not enhanced or increased the social networks available to a person with a disability to seek support from. And it has led to violence and exclusion and abuse. Worldwide, there are many examples of alternatives, including Asian examples. For example, in some countries in Asia, people prefer a clubhouse model, the hostel model, and so on. In the context of low-income communities, community programs have enabled circles of care or a neighborhood alert system to be with persons who may be in need of peer support during crisis. And such care systems involve both formal caregivers as well as non-formal caregivers, private parties as well as government agencies. There are certain new concepts coming in, for example, foster caregiving, companionship, functional proxy relationships in neighborhoods. These are all accepted practices in some of these programs. Such programs work with a broader vision of creating emotionally sustainable communities. When we have emotionally sustainable communities, the chances of people falling out of the psychosocial buffer created by those communities is minimized. Asia region is strong in its collective ways of living, and so many such examples exist for...
Audio is lost. I'm sorry, the audio is lost. Can we reconnect to the audio? I don't know where the technical support is.
No, we had it. Okay.
It's come back on, so not sure where
the captioning is gone.
Yeah.
Who is working on it?
We can hear it. It's okay.
It's not going on and on.
Yeah. It's working.
Yes.
Yeah. Worldwide, there are many examples of alternatives, including Asian examples. Yeah. We've talked about, now we're talking about community-based mental health and inclusion services, where inclusion service involves, going beyond the traditionally given services that we are used to, for example, counseling services. So inclusion services goes beyond some of that. And to explicate, give an example In some programs in Asia, we have talk about circles of care, which involves the neighborhood in coming into the program as informal caregivers. There is also foster caregiving, companionship, functional proxy relationships, and so on, which are being proposed as a way of increasing the continuum of care. So such examples do exist.
The captioning.
Sorry, it's because the song is on.
Oh, okay. So such examples do exist, and we would like to see a time when the state will come in more proactively as to foster community life rather than coming in only to set boundaries and to kind of make actions that will lead to deprivation and exclusion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. We are still working on getting the captioning back. I hope it is coming. Do we have a connection now?
We have two more.
We have to move on. We have to move on because time is running. And okay, wonderful. Captioning is back. I turn now to Peter Mittler. And my question to you, Peter, is why has it taken 10 years for persons with dementia to claim their rights to access to the CRPD? And then how can the CRPD committee support people with cognitive impairments? Peter, the floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I answer your question, I just want to make the fundamental point that persons with dementia have lived independently and have been included in the community all their lives, but as soon as they get a diagnosis, they encounter deep-rooted and systemic attitudinal and societal obstacles to continue to do so following diagnosis. I think we have some affinities with the psychosocial community here. The community of people with intellectual disabilities, with whom I've worked all my life, are defined as having attained their intellectual disability before the age of 18. So they've had the disability all their lives. They also encounter systemic obstacles, but people with dementia are in general older, so they have had no problems except those caused by other barriers to do with gender, ethnicity, poverty, etc., with which we're all very familiar. Now, obviously, I have to use the word dementia. Dementia is a medical diagnosis, and I know the committee doesn't like these diagnoses, but I think we tend to regard ourselves as people with cognitive impairments, not just memory problems, but a wide range of cognitive impairments, which are very well described by people with dementia who write. And many of them do write, and they communicate extremely well. They are a very articulate group. I represent Dementia Alliance International, which is now only 2 years old, but has over 1,500 members, gets new members every week. It's a very active group. Now, when I started going to dementia conferences and read books about dementia about 10 years ago, I was very forcibly struck by the difference between the mood and the content of dementia conferences and those that I'd been used to in disability all my life. There was just no sense of militancy. People talked about the difficulties they had, but then they were not really listened to. People with dementia are treated respectfully within the dementia world, but they are not really listened to. It's a good thing to hear the stories. So an image came into my mind after a short while of this experience. I see dementia and disability as two planets, and occasionally they come near one another. They're aware of one another's existence, but they don't have any means of communication. So that's one reason why it's taken us 10 years to come to you, because it was only in March 2015 that our chair, Kate Swaffer, had a major role at the World Health Organization conference of dementia, the first ministerial conference of its kind, And in her demands of ministers of health and of WHO, access to CRPD was one of her direct demands, and that is why I am here today, because in the last 12 months we've been very busy trying to turn that rhetoric, which was accepted by the World Health Organization in principle, into some kind of reality. So we are here to join. So that was a seminal moment in March 2015, and we are working very closely with the Alzheimer's Disease International. They are the major international organization of societies for persons with dementia. They differ very much, but the situation has been described in Asia in this conference is very much similar to ours. So that's really the first question. People with dementia don't consider themselves as disabled. They're disinclined to join the disability movement. Now, the second question is, how can the committee help? Well, I think it's very powerfully placed, and even what I've heard today has given me more ideas on how the CRPD committee can be placed. Individual members of the committee have gone out of their way to support us already. But as a committee, I think we're asking the committee to use every possible opportunity to inform key organizations within the United Nations system, including the human rights institutions, the older persons institutions, and so on, that we exist and we have every right under Article 1 to the Convention. So, as a committee, use every opportunity to clarify that people with dementia must be included in the system. In relation to OHCR as a whole, inform the other treaty bodies. These are very important. Social, cultural, economic rights is absolutely fundamental to us, but so are many, many of the other articles and many of the other treaty bodies. So in relation to that role of the committee, the message needs to get over. There is one very specific institution that I must mention that is worrying us a great deal, and this is the World Health Organization. I am not at all critical of the World Health Organization. It's provided brilliant leadership, both on disability and in dementia, but in two separate departments, two silos that do not communicate. There are two major reports written without communication between the two teams writing them. Now, the specific issues are that WHO has an excellent policy on disability, the 2014-2017 Disability Plan, and the whole of that plan is built on CRPD. And it seems to me that the WHO is the most disability-friendly UN institution that I know about. But when you look at its plan, look at dementia strategies, which are now springing up in many countries as a result of the G7 and G8, there is no indication in regional or national dementia strategies of the influence of the CRPD. And even more worrying than that is community-based rehabilitation, which is really important for low and middle-income countries. I know the history of CBR, and I have seen their plan. It is also built on CRPD, but I see no evidence that people with dementia are included. So that the WHO is our biggest concern, but it is only one task, I think.
Thank you very much, Peter. And the last speaker is Shanta Rao-Bariga, and the questions to you is, drawing from the research done by Human Rights Watch, what are some of the other rights that are impacted and interlinked with Article 19? And the second question is, in your view, how does the right to live in the community extend beyond the right to not to live in an institution? The floor is yours.
Thank you. I will keep my remarks brief given the time. And I wanted to underscore some of the points that were made earlier about the interlinkages, particularly to Article 12, but we'll not talk about that since I think it was discussed, and we'll focus instead on Article 14 and the link between Article 14 and Article 19, which I don't think has been discussed yet. Article 14 being on the right to liberty and security of the person. And similarly to the restrictions on legal capacity that we've heard about today, there are laws around the world that continue to allow the involuntary detention of people with disabilities and provide few meaningful chances for them to challenge their detention. So, for example, a young man whom we met in Somaliland, Mansour, 39 years old, has a psychosocial disability. He has been detained in a rehabilitation center for 10 months. He told Human Rights Watch, "My father ordered my brother to bring me here. They told me I'm mad, but I don't want to be here, and I don't like to be here." So we encourage, in spirit of these kinds of quotes, which we've heard in many countries around the world, we want to encourage that the general comment makes specific reference to the impact of involuntary detention, involuntary hospitalization, and forced treatment on persons with disabilities, particularly those with psychosocial disabilities, and impacts their right to live in the community and be included in the community. On the second question, it's important to recognize that the right to living in the community is more than the right not to live in an institution or not to live in a mental hospital, but it involves the ability to go to school, access health care and support services, secure employment, and enjoy leisure activities on an equal basis with others. People with disabilities may be isolated in various ways, even if they do physically live in the community. For example, we met a young man in Russia who is confined to his home because public transportation is not accessible. His home, he's in a wheelchair. He can't even leave his room because the housing is not accessible. Education, employment, healthcare facilities are also not accessible in so many countries, which limits the ability of people with disabilities to live and largely live confined in their homes. And as Bhargavi underscored, there are interlinkages between these services that need to be reinforced for people with disabilities to truly participate in all aspects of community life. But there are other ways Article 19 can be compromised for persons with disabilities even when they live in the community. What we've just documented in Indonesia, for example, how people with psychosocial disabilities are shackled in chains, in wooden stocks, even in animal pens. They're denied the interaction with their community in large part because of the lack of mental health services and the widespread misconceptions about mental health, which Michael Njenga spoke about earlier. So it's really key that we think about Article 19, and right to live in the community means so much more than actually being physically present in the community. And one final point, building on Sanada's presentation in the previous event, we want to underscore the importance of the principle of leaving no one behind and providing guidance to governments on support and assistance to fulfill the right of living in the community for people with high support needs. We have seen in many countries that people with high support needs are usually the ones who spend their entire lives in institutions, and for those that are transforming into the community, they're the last ones to be given the opportunity to leave. High support need is no justification for institutionalization. The right to live in the community and be included to live independently and be included in the community is a right that every person, without exception, should enjoy and respect it. That's all.
Thank you so much, Shanta. I have a list of speakers from the floor, but I need to ask the speaker, the people to hold their questions for the next panel, and we will hopefully then have time to let people from the floor speak and interact with panelists. I would like to thank all the panelists for coming and enlightening us. All your submissions, all your interventions will be taken into account by the committee, by the working group, which will draft the general comment on Article 14. And I think we have learned a lot so far. And with this, I would like to close the panel one now, and I leave you to the lunch break. There are several side events, and the panel 2 will start again at 3 o'clock in this room. Thank you so much.